So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues of our institute, it's a great pleasure for me to have here in this building a very distinguished guest, a good mine for I don't know how many years. Too many years, decades. He's still too young as compared to me. He's visibly a junior one, you know. So I would like to introduce Christopher Monckton, Viscount Monckton. We don't have many Viscounts in this country. Nevertheless, it's a good moment that you are here. We had a chance to meet on many occasions in different countries. Different gatherings, conferences, meetings, and I think we were always on the same side of the barricade, fighting against someone and against something. Christopher Monckton is a well-known British, I don't know how to say, author, troublemaker, author, journalist, contrarian in any possible moment, politician as well, originally connected with the Conservative Party, then with UKIP, with this party trying to take Great Britain out of the European Union, which he's a big friend of the European Union, as similar as we, all of us here. So you will find here an audience which will understand your views and your stances and your position. Nevertheless, Christopher published a lot of things, books, articles, but the most visible, at least for me, was his debate about the nonsense of the doctrine of global warming, and that's where we met mostly at the Hartford Institute conferences in America and elsewhere. So I think it was a great idea that Jiří Brodský, by the way, Brodský will have tomorrow his birthday, so we should bring something after the presentation here to celebrate your birthday. He's still very young, you know. When you put together both of you, it will be my age. I would say approximately. So, Christopher, this is a group of people connected with our institute in different capacities. Some of them are currently with us, some of them used to be with us, some of them are in the board of our institute, are just colleagues, friends, contributors, various publications. So I'm sure they will enjoy having you here. When I look at the audience, it's not extremely politically correct audience. Madame Ursula von der Leyen would be very unhappy. So I hope that someone will send a cable to Brussels to say that we organize here, as regards gender, very unbalanced gatherings, and I'm sure you will understand it. But Christopher permanently speaks about his lovely wife, so this is a slight difference from what we dare to say here in this country. I will stop. I will give the floor to Christopher. He will, I don't know, how long do you plan to speak? 3 hours, 2 hours?
Not more than 3 hours, yes.
Yeah. But I can assure you that Christopher has a flight to London this evening from Prague, so there is some rational limit to our meeting. So, Christopher, once again, we are very pleased to have you here, and we are looking forward to your presentation.
Mr. President,
do you want to speak
stand
here or here?
What an enormous honour, privilege and delight it is for me to be with you, sir, and with all your good friends. The Czech Republic means a lot to us in the United Kingdom, largely thanks to the determination of President Klaus that although we are all good Europeans, or rather because we are all good Europeans, we don't necessarily like the centralization of all real power in unelected hands, specifically unelected hands of the commissars, as the Germans so aptly call them, who run the European Union. And there is, of course, a Duma, which is the elected but powerless parliament. And that political structure is, of course, the political structure of the old Soviet Union. They had a Politburo and a Duma, and that is exactly how the European Union operates today. And to me, as a passionate European, for this is a great continent with a magical history, it is an abiding sorrow that what I had hoped would be a body that would encapsulate and promote the values of freedom and democracy and prosperity has instead allowed the Soviet constitution to migrate westward and is now throttling enterprise and has successfully destroyed democracy in its own organization. And that's why I, for one, was so grateful when President Klaus was so willing to speak out so often and so courageously in the face of the intense pressure from the officials from the European Union. And so I do warmly congratulate him and all of you for having taken a path which is not too acquiescent in the bureaucratic structure that so denies to the peoples of Europe the voice that I had hoped and still hope that they could have in common in the community of Europe, which is not the same thing as the European Union as it has developed. So I begin then by saying that politicians are many, statesmen few. Of the latter, 4 came to eminence in the golden age they forged: Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Karol Wojtyła, and Václav Klaus. All 4 were libertarians. Throughout history, an abyss has divided 2 political factions: totalitarians, to whom the objective truth is nothing and the party line is all, and libertarians, to whom the truth is all and the only party line is that there is no party line. When we talk of the Thatcher era, we talk no less of the era of Reagan, of John Paul II, and of Václav Klaus. Today, it is my enormous honor to address the only living member of that great quadrumvirate of freedom, and to pay the warmest tribute to the courage and wisdom of your nation's former president in the face of the tyranny that he did so much to overthrow, to his vision in rebuilding his country out of the ashes that that tyranny had left behind. Remember how grey Prague used to be. It was as though it was just ashes. And look at it now in its splendor. And also to his leadership in inspiring his countrymen to march with him from the darkness of communism into the light of liberty. Let us then consider climate change from a Clausian no less than from a Thatcherite perspective, for the 2 perspectives are as one. Your former president's wonderful book, Blue Planet in Green Shackles, has been translated into all of the world's great languages and remains a bestseller to this day. There is nothing then that I can teach you, sir, about global warming. Therefore, I hope you will indulge me if I make a brief epistemological excursus. Here is the fundamental principle that underlies all true knowledge. Any proposition that is objectively true stands consistent with every proposition that ever was or is or ever shall be true throughout the universe of time and space, from the beginning of the beginning to the end of the end, and from here to the outermost stars. But any proposition that is false, even though it may stand consistent with other propositions that are false, falls inconsistent with every proposition throughout the universe of time and space that ever was or is or ever shall be true. It is curious that this principle of the unity and universality of truth is so seldom explicitly stated. Yet without it, logic, the art of reason, that underpins all mathematics and thence all genuine inquiry in the physical sciences, including meteorology, now profitably rebranded as climatology, would be as nothing. The application of that principle of the unity and universality of truth to the sciences was beautifully instanced by the Newton of the East, Abu Ali ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Haytham. He was as proud of his ancestry as I am of mine, in 11th century Egypt. And he said this: "The seeker after truth," that was his beautiful phrase for the scientist, "is not one who studies the writings of the ancients and, following his natural disposition, puts his trust in them, but rather the one who respects his faith in them, but questions what he gathers from them, the one who submits to argument and to demonstration, and not to the mere utterances of men whose nature is fraught with all manner of imperfection and deficiency. Thus, the duty of the student of the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads, and applying his mind to the core and to the margins of its content, to assail it from every direction. He should be no less suspicious of himself as he performs his critical examination of what he reads, so that he may avoid lapsing either into prejudice or into leniency." How then, I'm just going to show you a picture of Al-Haytham. There he is on a banknote from Iran. He appears on the postage stamps of at least 6 Arab nations. So we can learn as much from other traditions as we can from our own. And that great flowering of Islamic scholarship from the 9th to the 11th centuries under the enlightened Abbasid dynasty is one from which we can learn a great deal. What I read to you earlier is perhaps the finest formulation of the scientific method that has ever been written. Well, now, the way that a Klausite, a Thatcherite, a Reaganite, a Wojtyłaite would approach the question of climate change is that we would adopt the down-to-earth approach to heaven. We would be skeptical, not ideological. And we would ask a few straightforward, pragmatic, policy-relevant, and above all, quantitative questions. And I'm going to make no apology for using, as we go through this presentation, just a little bit of elementary arithmetic. I do apologize for that. I should have turned it off. Wait a minute. There. So the first question then is, were they right about what they call the science, or did they get it wrong? Now, any statesman who thinks that he can just spend any amount of taxpayers' money because some scientists get together and say, oh, the sky is falling and you have to give us all the money so that we can make it not fall, should ask these very pragmatic questions. So, for instance, when Donald Trump's staff asked me for a one-page brief on the error by climatologists, I sent the requested brief to the White House. Within 1 week of reading it, President Trump had withdrawn the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. So I'm going to explain in outline what that one-page brief said and explain some of the science and the economics behind it. Now, President Trump was by no means the only one to have grown suspicious of the party line on the climate question. Some years ago, at the invitation of the Russian Academy of Sciences, I was asked to give a talk about the error in Moscow. Afterwards, the young people in the audience gave me a standing ovation. And I asked them why, and they said my talk had been the only one at that conference that had given them, as young people, any hope for the future of themselves, their families, and their planet. Well, the Academy noticed this and then asked me to attend a high-level technical seminar led by the deputy chairman of the Russian Academy of Sciences, academician Semenyov. And he asked why it was that we could not narrow the 2 to 5 Celsius enormous range of predicted global warming by doubling the CO2 in the air, which is the standard metric used in the studies of the how much warming question, and is also equal, broadly speaking, to all the transient warming that all our activities with all the different greenhouse gases might cause from the year 2000 to the year 2100. The two figures are about the same, 2 to 5 Celsius. Why, after 40 years of study, said the academician, could we not constrain that range to something more precise? Well, after representatives of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and such like lobby groups had failed to answer the question, I described the error. After the seminar, Semenyov came up to me and said, "Come and explain your result to IPCC's representative, Professor Mojib Latif. What is this error? I think the IPCC should be told." So the professor, when I met him, opened by sneering that he supposed we should begin by stating the equation of climate sensitivity, the how much warming equation. And he was called away for a few minutes, and during his absence I scribbled 2 equations on a paper napkin. And when Professor Mojib Latif of the IPCC returned, I gave him the napkin. He agreed that the first equation was that which climatologists use. He seemed more than a little disappointed that I knew it. However, he was visibly, satisfactorily baffled by the second equation. I explained that the official equation embodied an error, which the second equation corrected. Academician Semenyov, watching both of us intently, saw that Professor Latif could neither understand nor refute that second equation. So he disposed of the professor and asked me to explain our result instead to the chief programmer for the Russian climate model, one of 40 such huge computer models worldwide in different countries. The programmer understood the point in 20 seconds flat. And he slapped his forehead and said, "I must leave at once." And academician Semenyov said, "Why?" He said, "I must go and reprogram the model immediately." And he did so to very good effect. Here you will see a graph by Dr. Roy Spencer, who is the very talented and extremely knowledgeable scientist who runs the satellite global temperature data set compiled by the University of Alabama at Huntsville in America, together with his colleague Dr. John Christie, both of these formidable, outstanding scientists. And Dr. Christie decided to look at what the various models from around the world would predict would have been the warming of the last 50 years in a particular area which was kind of fairly typical of the temperate climates, which was the Corn Belt states, just a dozen states of the United States. And he compiled this graph. And you will notice that the model that comes closest to matching what has actually happened in temperature over the last 50 years is indeed the Russian climate model. And now you know why that is. The Russian state, now that it knows the truth, doesn't bother to mitigate global warming. It has very little wind or solar power. It has, after all, a commodities economy. Its tiny population occupies a giant land replete with coal, oil, gas, gold, silver, platinum, metals and minerals of every kind, technometals. And its interest in this debate is in selling as much Siberian gas to Europe as it can, often at many times the world price. Now, formerly, power from coal, half the price of gas-fired power, was the chief source of electricity in Europe. During Margaret Thatcher's premiership in the 1980s, Britain obtained 70% of her electricity from coal. To this day, the Czech Republic obtains almost half of her power from coal. However, the International Energy Agency and the unelected commissars of the European tyranny by Clark are bullying you to stop using coal. The Kremlin, through its many agents of influence, has successfully importuned Western politicians to fear global warming that the Kremlin now knows perfectly well will be harmless. And it profiteers by exploiting the fear that it has engendered so as largely to extinguish competition in Europe from coal-fired power. Today, then, I'm going to make you my laboratory animals. I'm going to do an experiment on you. And in order to start this experiment, I want to ask how many of you have a degree or have written a significant body of peer-reviewed scientific papers in mathematics or in physics? Hands up. 2, 3. What a distinguished audience. That is much higher proportion than would normally be the case among the governing class. And it's what I would expect in the Czech Republic, whose science we have learnt to respect over the decades. But most members of the classe politique, as the French call them, do not have any understanding of mathematics or physics or of the scientific method, and the quotation from Ibn al-Haytham that I gave earlier would mean nothing to them. They would not understand its context, they would not understand its historical importance, they would not understand why it is that the scientific method is a disciplined and objective method of trying to reach the truth about how the natural world actually works. So my team first suspected that there was a systemic error because for almost half a century the observed warming rate has proven to be little more than half the long time predicted mid-range rate. So given that fact, how many of you here think that global warming caused by us is or is at all likely to become a problem? I see no hands. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you all very much. We first suspected this systemic error, and therefore we decided that we needed to find out whether there was one. There is indeed an error, it's fundamental, and without it, the climate emergency vanishes away. Climatologists, at a vital point in their calculations of how much global warming we may cause, forgot that the sun is shining. They forgot to take account of the fact that the sun and the temperature that comes to us from the sun is far and away the predominant influence on global climate. And the problem was that they'd made this mistake by borrowing from another branch of physics that they didn't understand. And it's a very complicated branch of physics. It's known colloquially as rocket science, and it's known to the engineering physicists who had originally developed it in the 1920s for electronic circuits in telephone systems in the United States as control theory. It is the theory of how feedback amplification occurs in dynamical systems such as a rocket or a steam engine or an electronic feedback amplifier circuit or the climate. And a dynamical system is one that changes its state over time in a way that is mathematically measurable and therefore studyable. So they borrowed this feedback mathematics, which, however, is wildly counterintuitive. And they had applied their intuition incorrectly, and they'd simply messed it up. They'd got it wrong. And the error went undetected for decades, thanks to the interdisciplinary divide between increasingly specialist areas of the physical sciences. So each scientist knows more and more about less and less. And scientists from different disciplines do not talk to each other or even understand each other enough to make sense when this kind of mistake arises. Now, direct warming, let's just put a slide up here. That shows you how, incidentally, we have had no effect so far. All that we've spent has had no effect on the climate. You can see that in 1993, 88% of all the world's power was generated by coal, oil and gas, and now it's 87%. And think of how many trillions have been spent. And I think, Mr. President, you would agree with me that even by the standards of macroeconomics, in which governments are prone to squander other people's money in ever larger quantities on ever sillier projects, it doesn't get much sillier than this. You would think that by now, having seen how little effect all those trillions have had, they would realize that they were wasting their taxpayers' money. So we're now going to look at the questions that we should ask here. The first one, did they get the science wrong? And we're going to look at how they borrowed this rocket science without understanding it, and then they forgot that the sun was shining. And they make this hysterical forecast that if you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by double, then the temperature will rise directly by only 1 Celsius degree on the left there. But then there is this phenomenon which they don't understand called feedback response. And you'll see that between 50% and 80% of all the warming they predict comes not from the direct effect of the greenhouse gases that we emit, which are known as the non-condensing greenhouse gases. They are not water vapor. They think it comes from the feedback response to water vapor in the climate. And it is astonishing how very few people in politics know that direct warming by greenhouse gases is more or less insignificant. You'd never worry about it were it not for this feedback response that they think is large, because, as we shall see, they simply don't understand what the heck they're doing. So let us start as Al-Haytham would have started, as Isaac Newton or Einstein would have started, with some data. And wherever I use data in this presentation, I shall be doing my best to use data that is mainstream, mid-range scientific data. I'm not using funny values that happen to suit my argument. I'm using their data. As far as possible, I shall also be using their methods, except where their methods go completely wrong. So I'm not saying that there is no truth in climate science at all. I am saying that in one, unfortunately, catastrophic area, they've got it badly wrong. So we start in 1850. And we start there because that was the first time we ever measured global temperature. It was done in England by the Hadley Centre and by the university, which is now the University of East Anglia. And between them, they still keep that global temperature record. And in 1850, these are the figures. We have to do it in Kelvin. And 1 Kelvin is, let's say that 0 Kelvin is, 0 Celsius is 273 Kelvin. Because 0 Kelvin is as cold as you could possibly get. It means there's no molecular movement at all. That's absolute zero. And we have to use that scale. But you can add Celsius to Kelvin quite happily, because the distance between 1 Kelvin and the next is the same as the distance between 1 Celsius and the next. So here you have the composition of global surface temperature in 1850. 288 Kelvin was the temperature. That's about 15 Celsius degrees. That's composed of, first and foremost, the sunshine temperature, 260 Kelvin. The figure you will normally see is 255, but that excludes the effect of the emissivity of the Earth's surface. If you correct for that, it's 260. But either of those figures would do. It doesn't make much difference. Then you have 8 Celsius of direct warming by the natural greenhouse gases that were already in the air in 1850. And that again is an agreed figure. Some say 10, some say 8. It doesn't matter, because the sun is so dominant if we get slightly different figures than others would wish to have. And then you have this curious business of the feedback response. So we know what the sunshine temperature was. There's an equation called the Stefan-Boltzmann equation by which we can calculate that. We know what the direct warming by the natural greenhouse gases was, because we can take the individual greenhouse gases, apply some well-studied ab initio formulae to work that out, and that's how that's done. And then you simply subtract the 268 Kelvin, which is the direct temperature in 1850, before you count any feedback response. You deduct that from the measured temperature, which was an equilibrium at that time, because there would be no trend in global temperature for the following 81 years until 1931. It was absolutely a zero trend. So we know that this was an equilibrium moment. And therefore, it's a good moment to start our study. So you deduct the 268 from the 288, and there you are, 20 Celsius of feedback response in 1850. That's how we get it. So then, what we do is to show how they do the calculation. And the paper in which this error of feedback analysis was first made was by James Hansen at NASA in 1984, an appropriate year, as you may think. And James Hansen was a bit of a climate fanatic, and he's been arrested several times for having done noisy protests and caused a disturbance of the peace in the United States. So he's a real climate campaigner. But he did not make this mistake deliberately. I once took his paper to an eminent control theorist in Australia who had 4 degrees in the subject, and I showed it to him. He said, I would never have allowed this paper to be published. It's quite clear that its author has absolutely no idea how control theory works. He just doesn't know what he's doing. And so here is the way that he thought that adding 1 Celsius of direct temperature from doubling CO2 since 1850, or from all the direct warming we might cause over the 21st century, you would then have to take the 8 Celsius of direct warming by the natural greenhouse gases plus the 20 Celsius feedback response, divide that by the 8 Celsius we saw before, and that is called the feedback multiplier. It has a number of names. We'll keep that a simple name for it. And so you multiply 1 Celsius by 3.5, which is how that fraction works out, and then you get 3.5 Celsius. And sure enough, Hansen actually does this calculation, and he says, therefore, we would expect to see 3 to 4 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, or therefore over the whole of the 21st century. That's how he did it. Now, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, in a little bit of handwriting, but where is the sun? Where is the predominant temperature signal in the climate in that calculation? It is wholly absent. It is significant because it isn't there. So how should they have done it? Here we are. What you do instead is you take the entire temperature in 1850, the final temperature in 1850, which is the 260 Kelvin of sunshine temperature, plus the 8 Kelvin, and you put that on the top of the ratio. That makes the feedback multiplier. And then you put the 268 Kelvin underneath, and then your feedback multiplier is no longer 3.5, it's just 1.075. So it's far less, and that means if you multiply that by 1 Celsius of direct warming, you get, rather unsurprisingly, about 1.1 Celsius of final warming. You see how elementary the arithmetic is behind this error. This is why they're so very embarrassed by it, because it's now becoming quite well known, particularly in control theory, but increasingly in climatology, and they don't like it. So if we compare the two methods, one on top of the other, there you see at the top, no sunshine temperature, but at the bottom, the 260 Kelvin temperature appears top and bottom in the fraction that is the feedback multiplier. You multiply that by the direct temperature of just 1 Celsius from doubling CO2, 1.1 Celsius, not 3.5. And that, ladies and gentlemen, that, Mr. President, is the end of the climate emergency. That is not enough warming to be anything less than the kind of natural variability of the climate over a century. But it gets worse, because the mistake they make is in not realizing that if there were a change in the feedback multiplier over time, across the industrial era from 1850 until now, then even a tiny change in that feedback multiplier would affect it would respond not just to the direct warming by us, but also to the direct warming by the pre-existing greenhouse gases, and most importantly, to the direct temperature that is the solar emission temperature, the 260 Kelvin. And therefore, the climate is in fact far more sensitive by about 2 orders of magnitude to changes in the feedback strength, feedback intensity, feedback multiplier than they realize. And to prove this, we take their 2 to 5 Celsius interval or range of predicted global warming from doubled CO2 or from all our activities over the 21st century. And we then work backwards to calculate what would the corrected feedback multiplier be that would give you each of those 2 bounds on the range of prediction. And you'll see that if you have 1.08, it's 2 Celsius. 1.09, it's 5 Celsius. And there is absolutely no way, given the huge uncertainties in the feedback variables, none of which can be measured directly, there's no way that you can prescribe precisely the feedback multiplier to anything like a precision of 0.01 across the entire interval, or 0.003 to 0.004 between 1 Celsius and the next of the range of possible temperatures that they predict. This is why they're using, in nearly all their calculations of global warming, they're using the wrong method. They're using a method which, precisely because of the predominance of the solar emission temperature, is entirely unsuitable as a method of trying to predict how global warming will evolve. So this, therefore, is a double error. It's an error which has led them to predict far more global warming than is likely. And it's an error which is using a method which can't be used for this purpose because of the predominance of the solar emission temperature. And here we can see how difficult it is to make a reliable prediction. Here we have what's called the feedback factor. It's another of the many feedback variables. I won't bore you with what they all do, but this is one of them. And what it shows is that if you take the uncorrected values that they come to of how much warming we may cause, which are up on the left there, ranging from 1 to 5 Celsius on this zone of the graph, then you can see that the breadth of the range of feedback factors that gives them their 2 to 5 Celsius of warming is 0.36, because they forget that that feedback factor also has to operate on the sunshine. So it cannot be anything like that big. But if you correct it as it is on the left there, you see the breadth of that feedback factor that gives you that entire range of 2 to 5 Celsius is only 0.01. So again, you simply can't do it. You can see you've got to know exactly where you are on that tiny line, 0.01, and that will give you the entire range of estimates. And that's why you can't use feedback analysis to work out how much global warming we may cause. So your next question will be, if you are as skeptical as you should be about all this, well, do they actually use feedback analysis anyway? So let me give you a simple figure. In 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 5th assessment report, mentions the word feedback 1,100 times. By the 2021 sixth assessment report, they mention it more than 2,500 times. Because they think that between 50 and 80% of all the warming they predict comes from feedback response, which in fact it can't do. So in that case, how can we work out how much global warming we may cause without using feedback analysis? And you'll see that we have crossed out the feedback loop there, and that image of the feedback loop is in fact the first ever published image of a feedback amplifier loop in a scientific paper. It's from Harold S. Black at Bell Labs in 1926. So, we now look at some methods that don't use feedback analysis. And these, as you'll see, some of them are very simple methods. In fact, some of them are even back-of-the-envelope methods. So let's start with this one. We've already seen it. If you make the assumption, which, broadly speaking, climatology makes, that there has been no change in the feedback regime, no change in the feedback variables since 1850, and that's a perfectly plausible assumption, then we're going to get 1.1 Celsius, because that feedback multiplier of 1.075 multiplied by 1 Celsius, about 1.1 Celsius. Now, is that a crisis over the whole of the 21st century? Is that an emergency? No. It's within the noise. It's within the uncertainty, the natural variability of the climate. On any view, that isn't enough to be a problem. So let's use another method, and let's put this one on the back of an envelope, one of my envelopes. And you'll see that we can actually test what climate sensitivity should be to doubled CO2 by observing that in 2020 there was 3.5 roughly watts per square meter, that's the units they use, of anthropogenic influence on climate. And that's about equal to the 3.5 units that they say you'd get of influence from doubling the CO2 in the air. And how much was the warming over that period? 1.1 Celsius. Where have we seen that value before? Oh yes, it was on the previous slide. So there are two methods which cohere in producing much the same answer. Here's a third method. Once again, it's so simple that it's on the back of an envelope. And one of the things that free marketeers do, and indeed even in business one does this, is you start by doing basic calculations on the back of an envelope, and very often that in itself is enough to give you a good idea of what a more precise answer might look like. So here we simply say that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2021 is predicting 0.2 to 0.5 Celsius per decade of warming, just as it did in 1990. This hasn't changed. And 2.5 Celsius to 2100 over the whole of the century. And then observed warming 0.15 per decade in the satellite record, which is not influenced by what's called the urban heat island effect, the effect of the direct heat emitted by the activities of man in the urban environment or factory environment, and then 0.2 Celsius if you include the urban heat island effect, which the terrestrial temperature records do. And likewise, that gives you 1.5 to 2 Celsius degrees to 2100. So it's a bit higher than the 1.1 we got before. But all of it is below the lower end of their range of predictions. And again, none of these figures gives any cause for concern. Now here is a more serious method. Here is what's called a Monte Carlo distribution. This was a technique invented by Stanisław Ulam, who was a Polish-American physicist working on the Manhattan Project. And they needed to be able to take multiple variables and take the uncertainty interval in each of those variables and then combine them in an equation that reflected the uncertainties in all of the variables in all the possible combinations of those uncertainties. And so you do it by spinning a roulette wheel, effectively. And in this case, my team spun the roulette wheel 9 billion times. And if you do that, you get a very nearly perfect normal or Gaussian distribution. And that tells you how much warming you really should expect. And the input variables, so there are only 5 of them, we use mainstream mid-range values for all of these and mid-range estimates of the ranges of each one. And as you can see, to 2 sigma, which is and of course all the economists here will know what that is, to 2 standard deviations, about 95% confidence, we can say that the warming would be 0.9 to 2 Celsius, much the same as on the previous slide, and best estimate, which is where the peak of the graph comes, about 1.3 Celsius. And that's a more serious, more detailed way of doing it. But the extraordinary thing is that all 4 of these methods do not depend on using feedback analysis at all. And they all cohere. And coherence is important in the sciences in predicting far less warming than the official warming. In fact, except right at the top end here, at 2 Celsius, it doesn't intersect anywhere with the official range of predictions which were obtained by applying feedback analysis to the outputs of computer models, which are themselves, in any case, incapable of making useful predictions of global temperature for other technical regions which are already published but are very carefully suppressed by those who are pushing this particular agenda. So that then shows, in perhaps the simplest way possible, that this entire nonsense is based on a strikingly elementary and not at all difficult to understand error of physics, which arose when they borrowed from somebody else's physics without having the faintest idea what they were doing. And they got it wrong. And in effect, to put it in the simplest terms, they forgot the sun was shining, which if you're a climatologist is kind of rather bad news. So now we look at another question. Would worldwide net zero prevent global warming anyway? Now you'd think that that was a kind of important policy question for politicians to think about. We're all saying that, the scientists are saying, we have to get to global net zero emissions. And so how different would global temperature look in 25 years' time if the whole world, rather than significantly just the West, committed economic harakiri in the name of saving the planet? Now, we've got to accept that as a slogan, saving the planet is quite a good one. But the fact is, you'd still have to ask the question, even if my team is wrong about this elementary error, and I submit that you can see now why we aren't wrong, but even if we are, how much global warming would be prevented by the target year of 2050 if the whole world, rather than just and significantly just the West, went to net zero? So let's have a look. And while I'm on this, how many of you have heard of King Canute, who was a Danish king? A couple of again, 3 or 4 very distinguished audiences. Now, King Canute was a Danish king of England way, way back, before even the French had invaded us successfully. The last time the French invaded anyone successfully, 1066. Before that, King Canute. And he was fed up, as you must sometimes have been, Mr. President. I'm so sorry about this. With, put this over there. He was fed up with his courtiers, his civil servants, thinking that because they were working for the divinely anointed king, they could do anything. They could command the sea not to rise. So he took them down to the beach, and he set up his throne. And he said, now, my courtiers, watch this. I'm going to show you something. And he stretched out his hand over the ocean. And he said, I command these waves to proceed no further towards me as the tide rises. I command the sea to stay back from the royal feet. I command sea level not to rise. And all his courtiers looked at him as though he was bonkers. And he said, gentlemen, you may think that I'm bonkers, but just watch what happens. He stretched out his hand and he glared at the ocean, and the sea stopped coming in. Only it didn't. It came in just as before, and it wet the royal tootsies. And only when it had got to his feet and made them wet did he turn to his courtiers and say, this is well recorded in the histories of the time, "Know this," he said, "that if even I, the divinely anointed king, cannot stop these little waves from coming in and wetting the royal Tutsis, then how much clearer should it be to you that you who are beneath me have no power to command those things which you think you can command just because you are royal courtiers. There is a limit to your power because there is a limit to mine. And therefore, give all praise not to me, but to him who solely has the power to command the tide to come in and to go out, and to command the waves and the weather." And that lesson of King Canute has been completely forgotten by today's politicians. So I thought you would like to see from an official record, this is the annual greenhouse gas index kept by the National Atmospheric and what do they call themselves? That's right, administration in the United States. This is the record of our influence on climate from various greenhouse gases. There are a number of lessons from this, one of which is that the influence of methane is much less than that of CO2, and it hasn't changed. So whenever you see people saying that there must be what Representative Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin in the US House of Representatives used to call a cow fart tax, you don't actually need one. Methane is a bit part player. There's very, very little of it in the atmosphere anyway. And even if all the cows went on doing what they do, it's not going to make any difference. But what is really striking is that the increase in our climate influence, measured in those units of watts per square meter, since 1990, again when the IPCC made its first report, has been a near perfect straight line. And so if I were to ask any of you to point out the point at which all those trillions that the West, and the West almost alone, has been spending on global warming, and where has it made an effect on that line, the answer is you can't do it. It's had no effect whatsoever. And one of the simple but effective rules of thumb in economics is don't throw good taxpayers' money after bad. If it's had no effect before, then you'd have to have very good reason for thinking that it will somehow have more of an effect in future, because it just won't. And let us see what this does to us, that we try, in the West only, to trash our economies in the name of saving the planet. Let's just take the United Kingdom as an example here. Energy consumption. And you'll see that in particular, in manufacturing, which is the blue line there has been a very noticeable decline. And just this week, the last primary steel producer in Britain gave up and said, we can no longer afford to make steel because we can't use coking coal, because the Greens won't let us, and the government won't let us, because the government is entirely influenced by the Greens. And so this is what is happening to our manufacturing industry. And our recently retired Chief of the General Staff said that we could now only fight a small war for 1 week. We who used to command an empire spanning the globe. We who helped to defeat Hitler in the Second World War, now we could fight a small war for 1 week. After that, we would run out of tanks and guns and aircraft, and we couldn't make any more because we don't make steel anymore. The very engine of the Industrial Revolution, which was Britain, is now finished because of this global warming nonsense. But now let's look at what is happening elsewhere in the world. Are they paying any attention to this global warming thing? Well, no, they're not. We've already seen how the Russians know that there isn't a problem with the climate. And this is a very significant graph because there's a big difference between Russian and Chinese approaches to national debt. When Putin came to power in 2000, ousting Mr. Yeltsin, forcing him to resign. And then within 3 years, he'd appointed 6,000 KGB operatives into all the senior positions in Russia. His first ambition was to control the national debt, which was at that time 92% of GDP. And so he made a great effort to bring that debt down. And you'll see over the following decade or so, he did very well. And even now, even with war in Ukraine and so forth, it's kind of 15, 16, 17, 18% of GDP. Now, this is a remarkable achievement, and it's achieved, among other things, by having very cheap, very affordable energy. They have virtually no wind or solar power in Russia because it isn't useful except in very specific circumstances. And then we look at the general pattern of national debt. And we take the top 21 countries, I think it is, who have national debts. And you see the UK has just made the list. It's gone up to 100%. You'll see that the Czech Republic is a commendable 44%. Now, I wonder why that is, Mr. President. It's almost as though somebody who knew what he was doing about economics was Prime Minister and then President of his country. Do you think that might have had something to do with it? Because I do. The country was properly structured economically. It therefore has a responsible level of national debt, which is well within the Maastricht Treaty limit of 60%. And to get a visual impact of 60%, the names of the countries are on a slightly paler background, and that paler background reaches up to 60% of GDP. Everything over that is in a breach of the Maastricht limit, which I was one of those who made sure that limit was there, because it wasn't there originally. And I feared that as a result of the way the EU was developing, national debt would become a crisis. And so at least we tried to put in some sort of legal barrier as at least a token to try and stop it. But you'll see also that China has a very different view of national debt than Russia does. Since 2011, in fact, it's gone up from about 15% of GDP now to 84%, a very, very rapid increase because there has been enormous borrowing. And the borrowing reflected in these figures is just the borrowing done by the Central Committee, the State Council, as it calls itself. Whereas most of the borrowing now happens at regional and local level by the command of the Central Committee, so that that borrowing doesn't appear in the official state borrowing figures. So it's probably worse than that. And to take one example of what has happened in China, they have built, and they're very proud of having built, an enormous railway network of very fast trains going across China and all the way up into Tibet. And what is the economics of this? Well, first of all, the State Council does not borrow to build railways. It orders the regional and local authorities through which the railways will run to borrow to get the railways to come. And the debt on this very rapid expansion of the Chinese railways is now so great, and it doesn't appear in the national figures, remember, that the entire annual ticket revenue from all ticket sales on the entire network is woefully insufficient even to meet the costs of interest on that accumulated debt. So this is a very different economic model in China, very like the economic model which, alas, has been followed in many Western countries less prudential than the Czech Republic. And China, too, realizes that the cheapest way to generate electricity is through coal power. And you can see that because it's only the West that is busy shutting down its industries in the name of saving the planet, 70% of primary energy use growth in the world comes from countries who are either exempt or who have exempted themselves from the Paris Climate Accords. And that means whatever the West does, it isn't going to make any difference anyway, because the rest of the world, and in particular the four great communist-led giants of the East, India and Pakistan, Russia and China, they are not going to do this, except to a very small extent, just to show the West that they are doing it too, when in effect their real expansion comes in the use of coal-fired power, as you can see here. Now, Mr. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, told the G7 conference last year that India was not going to worry about climate change, it was going to worry about economic growth first. And therefore, it's going to increase its total generation of coal-fired power by 60% in the coming decade. Pakistan is going to increase its generation from coal by 300%. China, which already has somewhere between 1,100 and 1,200 coal-fired power stations, announced 43 more last year. And hands up any of you who have heard any complaint about that from any of the so-called green, environmentally concerned organizations who are worried about climate change. I see no hands. Now I wonder why that is. Surely if one were really concerned about saving the planet from the awful emissions from coal-fired power, one would be mounting continuous protests outside the Chinese embassies in all the great nations of the earth. Only it isn't happening. I wonder why not. But then we have to ask, well, let us suppose, let's pretend that the rest of the world follows what the British political class rather naively describes as our climate leadership. We are trashing our economies completely, and we want to show you the way so you can trash your economies too. That's climate leadership as defined in many Western countries, including, alas, Britain. So if we pretend, it isn't going to happen, but let's pretend, that the whole of the world went to net zero globally, and we actually got there in a straight line from here to 2050, how much global warming would that prevent? You see, from a policy point of view, a Thatcherite or a Klausite would not ask how much damage is global warming going to do. We would ask a much more important, a much more direct question, which is how much, or rather how little, global warming could the world possibly prevent, even if all of us went to net zero by 2050? That's the policy question. And that's the question that's answered in a simple form on this slide. You start off with that graph we saw from NOAA, and that tells you that what would happen over the next 25, 26 years if we actually went in a straight line from here to net zero. And then you can work out, translate that into the how many Kelvin of warming per unit does that represent, and then you look at, therefore, how much warming would be abated by global net zero. It's a very straightforward calculation. How many of you have seen that calculation or anything like it anywhere ever before? Now, that is the sort of calculation that any policy advisor worth his salt would be doing for his prime minister or his president, and would be saying, sorry, Mr. President, sorry, Madam Prime Minister, this is not going to fly. It doesn't matter even if the whole world goes to net zero, the climate won't notice. So 0.2 degrees Celsius, 1/5 of a Celsius degree, if the whole world went to net zero. But that's before we correct for the error that we looked at. And that's before we correct for the fact that warming is happening, just as the correction of the error would lead us to expect, at half the rate that they originally and still predict. That takes it down to 1/10 of a Celsius degree. 1/10 of a Celsius degree if the whole world went to net zero. And then the Paris-obligated nation's share of that is only about 1/3, so make that 1/30 of a degree, because the rest of the world certainly isn't going to do it. And if you take individual countries, if you just took the UK's contribution to that, even if the whole of the UK got to net zero, and we won't, despite the various politicians thinking that we might, 1/1000 of a Celsius degree. And in the Czech Republic, 1/4000 of a Celsius degree. And it's these figures that are most easily understood by ordinary folk who might be baffled by science, might be baffled by economics generally, but they will understand that if you tell them, if the whole of the Czech Republic went to net zero by 2050, the world would be 1/4000 of a degree cooler than if we carried on as we are. That is the kind of information which, once people understand it, starts changing the political landscape. So then, a Thatcherite, a Klausite, would ask, how much is it going to cost us to reduce global temperature by 1/10 of a degree by 2050. Now, this is the candy cane question. Think of Prince Radut, a child. He goes into a sweetie shop, and he takes a few sticky coins from his pocket and he slaps them on the counter, and he says, "How many candy canes can I get for this, miss?" Because even a kid knows that you have to ask the candy cane question. It is the most fundamental question in all of economics, the value for money question. What do I get if I spend this? So how many government assessments of the value for money in spending on global warming mitigation have you seen? I have not yet seen any. And that is a very curious omission. But let's now try to answer the candy cane question. We have to start with a real piece of data. And these are very, very hard to come by. But a couple of years ago, almost unnoticed and entirely unreported, the British National Electricity Grid Authority, National Grid ESO, actually did a calculation of what it would cost just to set the UK grid to net zero. And the answer was $3.8 trillion. But that's only a quarter of the UK's total emissions, represented by the grid. And the UK emissions are 0.8% of global emissions. So if we do a simple back-of-the-envelope pro rata calculation, then this is a ballpark figure that the cost of abating all global emissions and getting to net zero by 2050 would be $2 quadrillion. And you can then answer the value for money question, the candy cane question, by saying, okay, if we spend $1 billion, how much will that reduce global temperature? And the answer, 1/20 of a Celsius degree per $1 billion spent. And again, these are they're startling figures, but they're very comprehensible to ordinary folk who are not familiar with how policy is made. But if you show them this kind of figure, they will make the obvious point, why on earth are we trying to do this if it's not going to have any effect anyway, and if you spend $1 billion and you only reduce global temperature by 1/20 of a Celsius degree. So it's these kinds of simple arguments that are what work in changing the minds of the public. So then we ask very briefly, is global warming beneficial? Now, the heavily communist-influenced Western news media seldom report the benefits of warmer weather. Everything is reported as a crisis. There's a flood in the Vltava, global warming. There's a drought in the Vltava, global warming. It can't actually be both. It's either one or the other, or neither. The true answer is there won't be enough global warming really to make very much influence on extreme weather events at all. So let's look at what's happened. In the last 100 years, that's my lifetime plus not very much, there has been a quadrupling of global population. And yet, this is according to Björn Lomborg, who many of you will know, a very distinguished economist who has studied these questions, the number of deaths from any climate-related cause, which is the blue line there, has fallen over the last 100 years by 99%. How many of you think that that represents a problem for humanity? Not surprisingly, I see no hands. And here is what's happened to crop yields over the last 60 years. They've tripled. Partly because of CO2 in the air, which is very good for all plants, but mostly because of modern methods of agricultural fertilization and so on. But nevertheless, I do not see an emerging climate change-induced problem in that UN graph. And then here is a phenomenon which is directly and pretty much solely attributable to the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 is plant food. It's essential in photosynthesis. And so there's paper after paper in the scientific literature, never reported somehow in the mainstream media, which shows that, and this is a Chinese paper, it shows that the total green biomass of all living plants and trees on Earth, this is known as the net primary productivity of plants, has increased by an astonishing 15 to 30%, depending on which authority you rely upon, over just the last few decades. This is an astonishing change, and it's very good for all life on Earth. Again, I don't see a climate problem. And the consequence of all this extra growth is that famines have collapsed. They still happen, but look what's happened in the era of global warming, which really began in 1976 with the Great Pacific Climate Shift, a natural event. But in the era of global warming, record low number of famines worldwide. How many of you have seen that fact reported in any mainstream news medium? I see no hand. Well, then we ask another boringly pragmatic question. Is global net zero even possible? And Western governments have galloped ahead without even asking whether you can do this at all. And as we shall see, you can't. And the main reason for this is the extreme scarcity of the rare metals known these days as techno-metals. And Professor Simon Michaud of the Geologian Tutkimuskeskus, which is the Finnish Geological Survey, spent many years writing a 1,000-page report saying, right, if we really wanted to get to net zero with a typical mix that we might expect of nuclear power and then windmills and solar panels and electric buggies, then how much of these techno-metals would we need? It's not like building a nuclear power station or a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power station or an ordinary automobile which uses steel and concrete, of which there's plenty. These techno-metals are very, very rare. And so he worked out, it's a rather useful calculation, but he did it in terms of the total annual global production of these techno-metals, of which I've listed 7 here. And you'll see that lithium, which you need in all these batteries, you would need nearly 10,000 years' worth of the total global annual current output of lithium. And you'd need it every 15 years. Because it's not like a nuclear power station or a coal-fired power station that goes on for 60, 80, 100 years. It goes on for 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 if you're very, very lucky. 15's about the average. So every 15 years, you're going to need 10,000 years worth of the total global annual current production of lithium hydroxide and lithium carbonate. Well, how likely is that? And if you want to make vanadium steel, which is essential to windmills, it's essential to the structure of the batteries, you would need 67,000 years worth of the total annual output. And so his conclusion, which he gave to the Economic Committee of the House of Lords a couple of years ago, is very sorry, but because of the scarcity of techno-metals, it can't be done. And so they said, well, surely we can find more. And he said, well, we can always hope for that. But one thing is very clear, is that with the demand, which will leap up because of this artificial extinction of the other methods of generating power, it's going to be very much more expensive, even if you do find more. And he said, just look at these very extreme shortages. It's really not going to be possible to do this in time. So net zero cannot be done. And this was the reply of their lordships. You see, Professor, you're being so unduly negative. They were so fixed on achieving this political goal that when somebody said, actually, in practice, it just can't be done, they couldn't encompass the change in thinking. There is also a moral dimension to this. These are the various banks, and even the British government is in there, which have, over the recent years, decided they would no longer lend to African countries desperate for coal-fired power because it is the cheapest way of generating electricity, and it is relatively low-tech. And these days, it is not only very clean, but there's lots of spin-offs in the shape of the fly ash being trapped and made into house bricks. And so there are many, many benefits in coal-fired power, and the negatives that used to exist have largely been extinguished by modern technology to filter out anything that goes up the chimney, except CO2, which, as we've seen, is healthily net beneficial. So now, countries desperate for electricity to develop their economies as we have developed ours are being told by the West, in what a South African diplomat that I spoke to the other day said was one of the nastiest examples of neo-colonialism he had ever seen, that they're not allowed to raise money to build coal-fired power stations. And that is a moral question. Is it our right to say that we know better than you about saving the planet, we've taken full advantage of these planet-risking coal-fired power stations, but you can't? I find that a very disfiguring line to take. This is the effect that it has. This is our satellite. You'll see Africa turned on its side, because that's the way the satellite looked at it. And you can see that on the left, that's Europe, southern Europe, a blaze of light. But look how little light there is in the teeming continent of Africa. Hardly any. How can they expect to develop and learn to stand on their own feet economically if they cannot have the only affordable, low-tech form of electricity that they can afford and manage? So there is a moral dimension which we should not be frightened to advance, because the Greens and the extremists tend to say that theirs is the moral case. Well, it isn't. This is the moral case. This is what happens when you try to interfere with science for political ends. So the conclusion, then, is that you should not forget that the sun is shining. It is shining, and we shouldn't ignore it. So I would like to end by saying this, that however gloomy the landscape may look, as we see the communism that you expelled so successfully from your land creeping back in so many ways and throughout the West, this is a matter that makes me very sad, because we fought very hard, as you did here, to keep communism at bay, eventually, as we thought, to overthrow it. And yet there is hope. Savage censorship of the truth, hate-filled Ruchmord, reputational assassination, directed even against eminent Nobel laureates who dare to question the party line on climate change, and the sheer absurdity of each aspect of that party line that has been revealed here simply by seeking the objective truth in a simple, quantitative way. All these are signals of the desperation of the world's tyrants as they come to realize that the truth that they have long scorned in this, as in many fields, cannot be indefinitely denied, and that by their censorship of it, they have forever lost what little support they might have enjoyed among the peoples over whom they so brutally rule. Censorship of the truth and promotion of manifest absurdities such as these mark the end of every failing tyranny. Truth and liberty will prevail, and this time, perhaps, let us make it so, worldwide and forever, under your great president, in whose presence it is a privilege to stand. You rebuilt your freedom. Let the utter intellectual bankruptcy of today's tyrannies provide the incentive for the world to follow his distinguished and successful lead. Let the truth prevail, and let freedom ring.
Thank you very much, really. It's almost to comment on this wide, comprehensive talk. I was privileged to get into my hands some earlier version of your talk and of your analysis. It was impressive always. It is impressive now to hear it in real presentation. So thank you very much. I remember my studies of the topic. The feedback issue is absolutely fundamental, and that's probably the main reason why the IPCC scientists try to at least to forget it, or to make it rather incomprehensible, and the gases they are producing are terrible. The economic side of the matter, the costs of I think it's very good. Your point, very good point, was not only how much are we responsible for increasing the global warming, but how much would it cost to go a little bit down? We see that it's almost impossible, and the figures that if the Czech government would decide to eliminate all CO2 emissions, so the 4,000 of the global temperature can be saved. Definitely. We know from other publications similar estimates and similar guesses, but practically the dimension of it is totally in agreement with your point. So thank you very much. And the point, don't forget the sun, is probably very good. And if I remember the literature on global warming, the sun practically was non-existent item there. Everything else was discussed without giving the right context and without giving the right proportion, and your two multipliers with adding the sun and without the sun show it absolutely clearly. And so thank you very much for doing that. I don't know. Do you think, would there be any question? I'm afraid that no one. I say I was privileged to have in my hands earlier version of your presentation. So are there any comments? Oh?
Well, thank you for the comment about Prague, but before I was scientist and I was doing physics. So my comment will be more linked to that part where you're describing how the science was misused. And that was a time when I was chairing the Committee for Science and Technology at the very beginning of our transformation in the Czech government. And that was very interesting that a lot of these unsuccessful people in various subjects of science, they gradually moved to something very new, climate science, which was not defined. Anybody was aware what does it really mean? And that was a way how they were trying to get support. And now the situation is that if you are applying for grant or any agency which is supporting science, if you will not use these words, climate, renewable, and something like that, you will never get any support. So it's even these scientists are cheating. Maybe that they are partly aware that it's not really correct use of any model calculation, but they will not get any support. And that's another mistake which I see in that part of scientific approach to climate change is now popular because they will not get any money, and I don't see that as a moral approach it is good. That's the failure of scientists as they are. So that's my comment, nor maybe slightly the beginning of what you were saying about scientists.
That is a very interesting observation. And Professor Richard Lindzen, who is the world's foremost climatologist, has said to me exactly what you've just said to me. He said that everybody in MIT is rebranding himself as a climatologist. Didn't matter what they were doing. They might have been studying gardening, and now suddenly we're looking at gardening in the context of global warming, and then you get your grants. You're quite right. And so I don't think that the error that led to this, the first paper by Hansen, I don't think that was deliberate. I think on reading the paper, it's clear that he didn't have a clue what he was doing. And in that, he was a kind of prototype for all the other so-called climate scientists, because they themselves didn't understand control theory, didn't realize they didn't understand it, followed Hansen's paper without checking, and forgot that the sun was shining. So you're quite right. There is one of the most dangerous things that's happening in all this is that peer review no longer works. Because unless you support what I'm going to call, with more than a little justification, the Communist Party line on the climate, then you don't get grants. The grants are skewed only towards those who will support the official narrative. And that's why science itself is in something of a crisis at the moment, even though it doesn't realize it, because as long as you mention the magic words climate change, then you will get fat grants. And so the scientists that are no longer doing anything recognizable of science, they don't realize this crisis because they are profiteering at the expense of the rest of us, because they're pretending to do serious studies on a subject about which, as we've seen, they know less than nothing. So your question is absolutely on point. Thank you, sir.
It's interesting. We in the last decades, we were able to hear our friend just talking about the city issues, and I forgot his academic past. So thank you very much. Now it was Prague City Council, you know, and now we have the European Parliament.
No, I'm not anymore in this rather strange institution. Well, thank you very much, sir, for that presentation. And if I may ask you to spare a few more words about one aspect on that. You focused mostly on if I understood well, on a wrong methodology, which leads to a wrong results. Yes. And those wrong results lead us to wrong policies and economic and political decisions. However, you slightly touched also the other aspect of the whole problem, and this is that we underestimate the ability, even if there was a climate change, and even if there was a climate change in that level, which is wrongly predicted by those wrong methodology, we underestimate the adaptability of such a complex system like the Earth to absorb the level of temperature rise and to turn it rather into a positive result than the negative. Because whatever we can hear and we can read about the climate change, about the temperature rise, all that stuff is almost entirely negative, you know, that it would damage the environment, it would lead to some irreparable damages of this and this and that and that. And you rightly pointed out that it's not true. You shown us a few examples of that we might even count on positive side of that. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because
yes, I'd be very happy
it's usually
to do that.
Underestimated.
And may I first of all congratulate you on your beautifully concise summary of what was quite a long and hard-worked presentation. It was hard work for you to take on all this, but you have got all the points and expressed them so beautifully. But the point you now ask is the planet able to adapt? Well, yes, it is, because if you have a computer and you look at the main microchip, which is called the Central Processing Unit, or CPU, then that processing unit has sometimes billions of transistors built into the silicon, and it therefore gets quite hot when it's working hard. And so how is that heat dealt with? You have a plate of metal directly underneath the chip, which is a heat sink. So does the Earth have a heat sink? Well, yes, it does, and it covers 71% of the entire surface of the globe to a depth of several kilometers, and it's called the ocean. And so if the atmosphere warms up by 1 Celsius degree, the ocean warms up by 1/3000th of a Celsius degree, so it makes virtually no difference. And of course, the climate extremists have noticed this. So whenever they talk about the oceans getting warmer, they don't express it in terms of temperature. They express it in terms of zettajoules of energy, which sounds, and it is, an enormous figure. They say that it's being accumulated in the ocean. What they don't tell you is that those zettajoules of energy, when you convert it back to temperature, have an absolutely negligible effect on the temperature of the ocean. So the way they present their figures is trying to suggest to people that, you know, it's all going to be terrible, when precisely because the Earth is an essentially thermostatic system. The temperature, even between an ice age and a happy warm period like where we are today, the temperature range is the same as the temperature range that is built into the thermostat in your house to keep your central heating in the winter at exactly the temperature you want. It doesn't stay exactly at one temperature. It allows variations of 3 or 4 degrees either side, or rather 2 degrees either side of the exact temperature, total range of 3 or 4 degrees, so it isn't turning itself on and off constantly. That range of temperatures in your domestic thermostat inside your house is the range of temperatures between the depth of an ice age and the peak of a modern warm period. So you can see that these very small temperature differences can take you from an ice age into the warm period we have now. But if you're already in a warm period, even if the temperature goes up by another 4 degrees, which as we've seen, it won't, then the climate basically wouldn't notice. Yes, you would get a little bit of ice melting from the margins of Greenland and Antarctica, but not very much. In fact, I was once rung up at 6 in the morning in Australia when I was on a tour there by a very far left journalist who aggressively said, "You're on the air." And I was just waking up and he said, "You're on the air. I want to ask you about the climate." He said, "In Greenland, the temperatures is such that the enormous amount of water is going into the ocean." And he mentioned, I forget what quantity it was, he said was going into the ocean. And I said, "Yes, but have you calculated, even if we assume that the quantity you mention is correct, and for the sake of argument I'm happy to assume that, then how much would sea level rise?" And he said, "Well, I don't know." And I said, "Well, it's very simple. It would be 0.7 millimeters." He said, "How do you know?" Well, I said, "I know what the area of the Earth is, and I know how you do the water calculation. It's not very difficult. You can do it on the back of an envelope, or you can do it in your head." And I said, "It doesn't matter." So he slammed the phone down. He was so angry. And the next day, I was in a completely different part of Australia, and the head of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, who had heard this broadcast and was very, very angry with the journalist, had come all the way to where I was staying to come and see me at breakfast and say, "I apologize on behalf of ABC for the way that you were treated." And then he said, "Don't tell anyone, but of course you're absolutely right about all this." So there is a growing awareness, even among the worst of the broadcasters, that peddling this nonsense in the way that they're trying to do is beginning to look more and more absurd. And it's the absurdity of these suggestions that the sky is falling that is beginning to strike the general population as being a serious problem they need to take account of. They can see that it's not happening as it was predicted to happen. They can also see, more importantly, that it's becoming very expensive for the ordinary person through taxation, through regulation, through higher electricity prices, through having to spend twice as much for an electric buggy as for a real car. And given that the system can adapt so readily, even to quite substantial changes in temperature, which aren't going to happen anyway, there's a growing realization, which increases with the expense to the public of all this nonsense, that this nonsense is not sustainable, and therefore, yes, we will adapt where we need to. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. But you stressed just the adaptability of the planet.
Yes.
But there is additional dimension, which is an enormous adaptability of people.
Well, that's what I just said. Yes, quite right.
You know, those are two adaptabilities,
Yes.
and which one is bigger and more important? But Dr. Weigel.
I would like also to thank you for excellent presentation and very convincing arguments, but I am afraid that the global warming doctrine is not a scientific discipline anymore, but it plays more a role of quasi religion, quasi-religion, which I think people in the West feel that is missing, and they found something which they can trust, which can they believe. And so do you think that it's possible to convince the believers in global warming by rational scientific arguments anymore? Aren't you afraid that we are approaching an age of religious wars when nobody listens to the other, and that, hearing you, I remembered John Wycliffe from England and his heretic ideas, which found so fertile soil here in Prague. So aren't you afraid that we are approaching a dark age of such clashes in societies?
Well, I call this the age of endarkenment. It's the end of the age of enlightenment and the beginning of a darkness which happens periodically throughout the history of humanity, when a silly idea gains fashionability because the governing class typically, or the commercial class, find it convenient, expedient, or profitable. But in the end, the truth alone, as Father Vincent McNabb used to say in the 1920s in London, truth alone is worthy of our entire devotion. And so when I do my researches, I don't do them because I want to push the argument in one direction or another. We began our research, our team, because we could see that global warming wasn't happening at the rate that was predicted, and that it was proving to be handsomely net beneficial. You know, a point on adaptation again, you don't need to adapt to things that are beneficial. You can just sit back and enjoy the sunshine that climate scientists forgot. And that's the only kind of human adaptability that's really necessary. Get out your deck chair and get a suntan. So, no, I don't think we should be frightened of the age of endarkenment, because in all previous dark ages, there were always those, such as, for instance, the Arabs largely in Damascus and Baghdad and Al-Ahira, now Cairo, who kept scholarship alive when it was lost in Europe. They kept it alive. And then eventually we got it back from them because we pushed them out of southern Spain, and we found all this knowledge in their library at Cordoba, which is a huge library. And so, provided that knowledge can be preserved in such a way that they cannot destroy it, then there will come a time, how long it will take again for the age of endarkenment that you foresee, and I too can see this is a possibility. It will eventually come to an end. People will begin to understand. And they begin to understand typically at the point where the sheer absurdity of and you call it a religion now, there's a difference between a religion and a superstition. A religion is a system of belief which by its nature can neither be proven true nor false by any scientific method. I once had this out with the Astronomer Royal in Britain, who is a very charming and very able and very sophisticated atheist. And I was going to dine with him at the high table at Trinity College, and he came in a little bit late, and he said, "I'm terribly sorry, I've been in the chapel." I said, "What, a steaming heretic atheist like you in the chapel? What's going on? Have you at last seen the light and joined us in the soldiers of Christ, in the army of light and truth?" And he said, "No, but, the Book of Common Prayer, Cranmer's beautiful prose, and the reading which I did," he said, "from the King James Bible, that great jewel of English literature. Who could not want to experience this as theatre?" You see? And so I said to him, "And so why are you an atheist?" He said, "Well, because the universe follows scientific laws. You do not need to posit the existence of a God." So I said, "Well, when you see a clock, do you think that the pieces of that clock came together randomly and that it somehow then ticks accurately all by itself? Or when you see a clock, do you at least imagine the possibility that there might have been a clockmaker? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, the universe runs like clockwork. Newton's laws, Einstein's adaptations of Newton's laws. It runs like clockwork. It follows what you call natural laws. If you see an object, such as the universe, operating in accordance with what you call laws, does it not occur to you that there might have been a lawgiver? And he grew more thoughtful. So then I knocked him down by saying, all right, here's the final point. If you go back to the Big Bang, your natural laws cannot reach back to the moment of the Big Bang. You will be separated from that moment by the shortest distance that is physically possible, which is the Planck distance, sometimes called the Planck time, because time and distance are, of course, connected in Einsteinian physics. So I said, since you cannot get back to the moment of the Big Bang, from which you say the universe sprang, you cannot be sure that that process of the Big Bang was not set in motion by an intelligent clockmaker who intended the universe thereafter to evolve like clockwork. Now, can you? And he couldn't. So fear not. If we use reason and never fail to research the truth while questioning yourself as much as you question the other side, to make sure that you're not fooling yourself, that's what Al-Haytham says, then, provided there are those who are willing to do that and take the brickbats from the true believers in the new superstitions such as global warming, then humanity will come through the age of endarkenment and there will be the light at the end of the tunnel. Fear not, have courage, all will be well.